Long ago, in a small village called Willow Creek, there lived a fisherman named John who fished in the river near the village year-round to catch fish. He would often catch strange-looking fish that he didn't know the names of. One night, John had a dream where a man dressed in elegant robes like a king appeared. The man introduced himself as the river spirit of the river and told John that around Christmas time, a large fish would swim through this part of the river. The river spirit warned John not to catch this fish, because it was the second prince of the sea spirit in the deep ocean. If John saw the fish, he had to bow down and show respect without harming it. If he did this, his descendants would benefit from good fortune for generations. After saying this, the river spirit disappeared. John awoke and thought it was just a strange dream. He didn't really believe it, so on Christmas Eve he still went fishing as usual to catch fish for their holiday meal. When he cast his first net into the river, it felt heavy like it had caught on something. A strong force started pulling the net, trying to drag John into the river. The fisherman mustered all his strength to wrestle with the fish. Finally, he managed to pull it onto the shore. The fish was enormous, about half the size of a grown man. It thrashed around wildly with tremendous force. If John didn't have experience fishing in the right spot, and the fish wasn't tangled in the net draining its energy, there was no way he could have caught such a fish. John remembered the dream about the river spirit, but didn't believe it was real. His family was very poor and didn't have enough money for a nice Christmas dinner. So he took the fish home as usual, chopped it into pieces. He threw away the head, sold the body at the market to make a little money for rice, and cooked the tail into a delicious fish soup as an offering for his ancestors. After celebrating Christmas and going to sleep, John had the same dream again. The river spirit in his robes appeared, his face burning with anger. He pointed at John and bellowed, "You ungrateful peasant, how dare you? Your ancestors did good deeds, so I gave you a chance to earn fortune. But not only did you disobey me, you did something as disgusting as chopping up and beheading my son. From now on, your family's fortune has run dry." "I curse your bloodline. Your descendants will forever become drowned ghosts, fighting and killing each other in this river." After saying this, the river spirit disappeared again. John jerked awake, drenched in sweat, thinking about what happened in the nightmare. He told his wife about it. His wife was very frightened and advised John, "If the spirits have spoken, you'd better stop fishing from now on." John yelled loudly at his wife, "Nonsense! Our family has always relied on fishing to make a living. If I stop fishing, how will we survive? It was just a dream. There are no gods or spirits." After saying this, he ignored his wife's pleas and continued fishing in the river as usual. He paddled his boat out to the middle of the river and had just cast his net when a huge wave suddenly rushed towards him, flipping the boat and dragging both man and vessel down into the depths, drowning John. When he didn't come home that night, his wife sent their eldest son out to look for him. The son came to the riverbank and saw his father's body floating lifeless in the middle of the river. He hurried home to gather his mother and younger brother so they could retrieve the body for a proper burial. The family stood on the riverbank while the eldest son jumped into the water, intending to swim out and pull his father's corpse back to shore. But before he could swim even halfway across, he began thrashing and screaming, bubbles foaming up around him. Something seemed to be dragging him down from beneath. Then the eldest son also sank without a trace. Seeing this, the second son prepared to dive in for a rescue attempt, but his mother held him back. She knew the curse placed by the river spirit was real, and if her youngest went in after his brother, he would also die. So she adamantly refused to let him follow in his siblings' doomed footsteps. The eldest thrashed for a while before he too sank. After half an hour, his lifeless body also floated up in the same spot as his father's. From then on, the two remaining members of this family, terrified of the river spirit's curse, completely abandoned fishing and took up other trades, never daring to go near that stretch of river again. For generations after, the story was passed down among the Willow Creek villagers as mere folklore that few took as truth. Fishing as a profession also gradually declined along the river as fish populations dwindled over the years. In the village of Willow Creek lived Dong Phillips, a renowned painter and reciter of ancient legends. His large home at the edge of the village attracted many visitors, both foreign and local, who sought to purchase his paintings and listen to the tales only he could tell. The Dong family had deep, long-held roots in Willow Creek, the legend of the fisherman cursed by the river spirit to have all his descendants drowned as vengeful ghosts in the river had been passed down by grandfather Philip's grandfather and forefathers as a grim warning. What made this story significant was that the Dong family had an unbroken generational tradition of making their living from the river, while paradoxically never venturing near it. This taboo had been observed for so many generations that no one dared violate it. Family elders always invoked the fisherman's tragedy to warn younger generations away from that stretch of water. This practice led the villagers to connect the legend with the Dong family's avoidance of the river, assuming they were the descendants of that ill-fated fisherman. The Dongs feared the curse and resulting watery deaths if they broke the taboo. Philip was silently examining an ancient wood carving when he suddenly heard a loud voice call from the front entrance. "Oh heavens, Philip, have you heard the news?" A dark, wrinkled woman in her 50s with chapped lips scurried up to Philip. Philip frowned, removed his reading glasses, and turned to the woman. "What's happened, Mrs. Turner?" Mrs. Turner hitched up her sleeves and blurted out, "This morning, that huge concrete bridge just snapped clean in half." Philip looked surprised. "How could the bridge collapse? It cost millions to build. I just crossed it yesterday. Even if there were cracks or construction flaws, there's no way it could break that quickly." Mrs. Turner nodded excitedly. "I know. That's why I said it's bad luck. This morning, a huge freight ship crashed right through the middle of the bridge. Both halves dropped right into the river. Folks from the city are all gathered on the bank over there gawking." At first, Philip was intrigued and wanted to rush to the riverside to witness the spectacle. But after pondering a moment, his expression hardened as he looked severely at Mrs. Turner. "You should mind your own business instead of gossiping about things out in the world. I forbid you from going anywhere near that riverbank, do you understand? The entire family knows the prohibition. No one is allowed near it. You may not be bound by our taboo, but I won't permit you to mention this to my sons David and Tyler. If anything happens to them because of this, I'll drag you to our ancestral shrine and have Uncle Za punish you." Mrs. Turner shrank back, scratching her head. "Why are you being so harsh? I was just chatting. I know full well our family's taboo against the river." "I'd never think of violating it." Philip nodded. "Good. Don't make me say any more about this." He put his glasses back on and returned to examining the carved wood. After a long moment, he glanced up to see Mrs. Turner still standing there with a silly grin. Annoyed, he asked, "Do you have anything else to say? If not, stop loitering and go." Mrs. Turner put her hands on her hips and sidled closer, whispering loudly, "It's just that I heard the Eng family across the river is having an ancestral feast. That bridge collapse doesn't relate to this at all. But wouldn't Mr. Eng invite you over there for the occasion? I was just concerned about that, nothing else." Philip heard what Mrs. Turner said and froze for a moment. He thought to himself, "Oh right, with the bridge collapsed, how can I possibly cross over for Mr. Eng's ancestral feast?" Thinking this, Philip grew pensive again. He set his glasses down on the table and sighed to Mrs. Turner, "You make a good point. Ordinarily, it would be easy to go over there. But with my wretched luck today, of all days for the bridge to snap in half, I'm very conflicted about what to do now." Hearing this, Mrs. Turner was extremely pleased. She jumped up and said, "There, I wasn't wrong, was I? You kept scolding me not to care about things happening in the world, but this affects you, and affects my nephew too. Mr. Eng is our in-law, a man of status and authority, a big official in the county. If you don't show up, you'll offend him. Then if things with Kevin and Tiffany fall through, who will you rely on in your old age?" The more Philip heard, the tighter his eyebrows furrowed. He said, "Well, there's no other way now. With the bridge collapsed, I don't know how to get over there." To cross now, I'd have to go upstream about 10 miles where there's another bridge. But that's just a rickety floating bamboo bridge over the water. Not safe at all. Mrs. Turner asked, "So you're not going over anymore?" Philip decisively waved his hand. "Of course I still have to go. I must take care of Kevin and Tiffany's matter. He's my only son. If I don't look out for him, who will? I'm just trying to figure out an easy way to get over there." Hearing Philip explain, Mrs. Turner immediately squatted down, craning her neck to look up at him and offer advice. "I think this, at the wide river bend, Mr. Lung the fisherman has a big sturdy boat. Why don't you ask him for help crossing the river? If he takes you over, it'll be so convenient. Just 10 minutes and you'll be at Thung's place." Philip immediately shook his head and waved his hand. "No, that would violate my family's ancestral taboo. Let me think of another way. Go home for now." After shooing Mrs. Turner out, Philip was left alone in the empty living room, clutching his head in anxiety as he desperately tried to think of a way over. Just then, the landline phone in Philip's house suddenly rang. He hurried over to the ancestral shrine where the phone was placed and picked up. "Hello? Who is this?" On the other end of the line came Mr. Ung's voice, full of authority and gravitas. "Mr. Phillips, isn't it? Let me remind you about our conversation yesterday. You must come over tonight. I'm only waiting for you to introduce my future son-in-law to my colleagues. If you don't show up, I'll be very angry." Philip sounded cheerful and eager. "Of course, since you insist, I wouldn't dare disobey. I'll be there early tonight, don't worry." After exchanging more pleasantries, Philip hung up, not feeling any better at all. Unlike his tone on the call, his guts were now twisted up with anxiety. Mr. Ung's enthusiasm made him even more frantic about figuring out how to get there. At 5 p.m., right before dinner, Philip steeled himself and secretly headed for the riverbank to find the fisherman Lang. Before leaving, he mentioned to his wife that he was going to the Ung's place. Mrs. Lai was chopping pigweed in the backyard and didn't know about the collapsed bridge. She simply nodded in acknowledgement. When Philip reached the riverbank, he lingered there, pacing his bike back and forth along the edge several times, unsure whether to break his family's taboo. In the middle of the river, he could see a medium-sized boat anchored, nets cast. As the clock ticked closer to 6, Philip was in a panic about what to do. In the end, not daring to violate the centuries-old taboo, he decided to turn back. But just as he was about to steer his bike away, the boat suddenly moved. It slowly drifted towards him, the paddles on both sides sweeping rhythmically through the water. Philip steeled himself and stood rooted in place, waiting. Soon the boat pulled up to shore. A middle-aged man disembarked and gestured for Philip to get on. Philip couldn't make out his face clearly, but based on Mrs. Turner's description, this had to be the fisherman Lang she mentioned. Philip nodded and said, "Thank you, sir. Please take me across the river. I'll pay you well." The man, Lang, simply nodded. Without a word, he went over to help Philip lift his bike on board, then gestured for Philip to hurry up so they could shove off. As Philip climbed into the boat, he felt as if he was dreaming. He had broken his family's ancestral vow, all for the sake of his son's future. The boat slowly moved away from the pier, old Lang's hands rhythmically pushing the oars back and forth to cut through the waves towards the front. Because the current flowed slightly against them, the path the boat took became diagonally curved. The boat drifted at an angle towards the lower river bend instead of straight across, making the distance between the two banks longer. In the past, there used to be a ferry here for transport between the two regions. But ever since the concrete bridge was built, the ferry had been abandoned and left to ruin. Now, with the sudden collapse of the bridge, there was no other way to cross except by boat. The old ferry landing had been deserted, but the piers on both banks still remained intact. So when people crossed by boat, they would often follow the same path between the two former ferry piers. Seeing old Lang silently rowing without a word, Philip struck up a conversation in his boredom. "Mr. Lang, are you from a village nearby or from Willow Creek?" Old Lang didn't speak, just silently shook his head. Philip guessed, "Ah, so you must be from another region then." Old Lang remained silent. Seeing he didn't intend to talk, Philip assumed he was right. This Lang must be a migrant worker from elsewhere. Having lived here since childhood, Philip knew all the locals by face. If Lang wasn't originally from around here, it made sense why Philip didn't recognize him. Realizing his attempts at conversation were futile, Philip stopped asking Lang questions. He just kept his eyes fixed on the opposite bank, anxiously willing the pier to come into view soon. His expression grew increasingly annoyed and uneasy, as he felt the boat didn't seem to be moving at the speed it should. The boat kept creeping along at a crawl, yet the far shore appeared to actually be receding. Although waves still flowed evenly around the sides, the image of the opposite pier was gradually growing smaller in Philip's eyes. Agitated, he yelled at Old Lang, "How come we don't seem to be moving at all? Are we even going backwards towards the shore we came from?" But when Philip turned to look at Lang, he jerked back in terror, causing the boat to rock dangerously. Old Lang had vanished without a trace, yet the oars were still sweeping back and forth right on rhythm, as if an invisible person was rowing the boat, never missing a single stroke. Sweat beading his forehead, Philip looked wildly around until he noticed a figure sitting at the other end of the boat. Philip hurried over, tapped the person's shoulder and asked, "Mr. Lang, please keep rowing. I'm in a hurry to cross the river. It's almost time. Please row faster to help me." But the man didn't answer, just kept his head bowed low, fumbling with something under the water. He kept searching and searching, completely ignoring Philip. Now Philip was no longer afraid, but furious. He glared at Lang and said, "If you won't row this boat, then let me do it. Don't complain when I take over." Just as Philip was about to head for the oars, the man slowly turned his head at that precise moment. In the pitch-black night, barely lit by slivers of moonlight, Philip's mouth gaped as he gasped for breath. The sight before his eyes filled him with utter revulsion. The one he'd been talking to this whole time had a melted skeletal face with algae growing on it, and hollow eye sockets without pupils. In a gravelly, pained voice it croaked, "I lost my eyes. I have to find them before I can row again. Ungrateful great-grandson, why won't you help me look instead of disrespecting me?" Philip was paralyzed with terror as he realized it was too late. The one rowing the boat was no Old Lang at all, but a ghost, one of the drowned ghouls of Willow Creek River. And it had called Philip an ungrateful great-grandson, making him shudder as he recalled the old tale, and wondered if this specter was the cursed ghost from that story. Philip staggered back in panic. The boat, formerly dry, was suddenly damp and covered in algae. Water started flooding in, slowly sinking the vessel. The ghastly voice wailed, "My corpse has been soaking too long. My eyes keep popping out and floating away. Go find them for me." The petrified Philip squeezed his eyes shut, waving his arms as he cried, "No!" Water rose all around him, but he was too scared to open his eyes lest he see the ghost again. But keeping them closed meant certain death. Suddenly, hard hands seized his legs, dragging Philip under. He felt himself plunge as water flooded his ears, nose, and mouth. Philip gurgled and choked. Me, glub glub." Then he couldn't make another sound. Some tremendous force pulled him deep underwater. A hand pressed down on his head, holding Philip under no matter how he struggled.